Software is one of those rare fields where people have had extreme success without a degree. Unlike traditional careers like medicine or law that require undergrad and schooling even after, people have been able to land $200,000, $300,000, or even $400,000 jobs in tech with no traditional degree. This led to the rise of people not going to college and choosing to use a coding bootcamp to land these sort of opportunities. For people without a traditional degree, these programs were seen as alternatives that enabled them to get a great job within 3 to 6 months without the typical experience. The catch is that these programs cost thousands of dollars. I actually took a coding bootcamp from January to June of 2023. I actually found it was kind of a waste of money. Here's why you should avoid coding bootcamps, and here's what I'm doing to practice my coding skills instead. The main issue with a coding bootcamp is that it follows the traditional classroom model. The bootcamp I had 3 lessons a week that were each 3.5-hour classes per day, which frankly was just too much time to listen to someone talk at one go. They did try to break the class up by having instructional sessions and then classes where you would work with other people on group projects, but even then it was very hard to maintain focus for this amount of time. And the reality is that it's not just the coding, because I have coded for that amount of time or more. It's just the fact of the structure of the class. You often find yourselves not really paying attention or being able to follow what's done in the teacher section, and then when it translates to the group activities, you often find yourself confused. There wasn't enough time there, and there wasn't enough time really to practice the skill either. So by the time of the end of the class, if you had covered a lot of the concepts, you really just wouldn't know what you were doing by the end of the day. The reality is that software engineering is meant to be learned at your own pace. While it was good to have someone explain the high-level concepts like object-oriented program or ORM, I really just didn't need to pay somebody this amount of money to learn that material. The bootcamp I did structure a lot of the material in a pretty logical way, but they spent a lot of time covering concepts that really weren't relevant anymore to common languages. There's certain concepts they covered that you probably could have gone through in just a couple of minutes that they would talk about for hours or even days. This meant that some concepts that were no longer relevant at all basically got the same amount of time and attention as languages that were extremely relevant to things today. For example, React got about 1 to 2 weeks, as did some other older methods that are basically no longer used in the industry. At the same time, the heavy focus on classroom instruction meant that you really just weren't practicing the skills, which is what you need to do to learn how to code. It's kind of like trying to get fit by watching YouTube videos of somebody else exercising. At the end of the day, you might learn a few tips, but you'll never make as much progress as the first time you actually pick up the weights or tie your shoes to go for a jog. Instead of focusing on more certification or a classroom model, I'm actually using free Codecamp to go back and practice the skills I had in between so that I have a more well-rounded knowledge that I can actually apply to different projects. The second issue with the coding bootcamp is that they focus on certification over qualification. Because of the fast pace of the bootcamp, people often find themselves pretty behind early on. And the reality is that once you are behind in that sort of model, it's almost impossible to catch up. Like I said before, my bootcamp was 3 times a week and 3.5-hour sessions. They were all evening classes, and if you have a job, this can be a lot of stuff to try and do, especially after an 8 or 9-hour day. The class indexed very highly on homework assignments and projects, which meant that in theory you were getting hands-on practice, but the level of material that was covered in the class and then the level of difficulty in the homework was way different. So even within a few weeks, I regularly found myself scratching my head whenever I tried to do a homework problem. This meant that I used most of the time I had in terms of office hours or interaction with other students, or even independent study time, to really just focus on getting the homework done rather than actually really learning the concept. And oftentimes, a lot of people take a bunch of shortcuts, whether that's trying to find code online, whether that's spending all of like a TA or office hours time just to get those questions answered. You really don't get a lot of time to sink into the knowledge. You're kind of just focused on nailing the next assignment. I actually pretty regularly fell behind despite attending basically every class and actually really trying on the homework. And I knew there were dozens of people in my class who were way more behind than I was. I actually already worked in a tech environment and worked with software engineers, and so I had a familiarity to a lot of the concepts. But for a lot of people, this is the first and probably only time they're going to see it. And if they were working full-time, it's really hard for them to actually make those concepts come full circle. It worked for me because I was able to take those concepts, learn them in the evenings, and be able to apply them shortly after in my day job. This leads to a ton of people focusing on getting that certification rather than actually being good at coding when they leave, which means that they have that stamp of approval, but it doesn't really mean a lot. And oftentimes it's not the fault of the people. They either just have busy lives, or really the class curriculum just wasn't designed in a way for them to be able to really learn the material at a deep level. The course just simply doesn't give you the opportunity to practice those skills very well and apply them on your own just based off of the pace that they're built at. The last big problem is that because so many people went into coding bootcamps over the past 8 to 10 years, there's really a large oversaturation of bootcamp graduates. This has unfortunately diluted the talent and flooded the pool of applicants. And look, it's certainly not those people's fault. I'll never knock people who have gone out of their way to try and learn a new skill or better their life, but the reality is the volume of people who have entered coding bootcamps and gotten jobs means that it's much harder for people to stand out nowadays. If all you have on your resume is just that you have a coding bootcamp, you're simply not going to stand out to a hiring manager for them to be able to hire you. You need to go above and beyond to do a different project, find ways to work with local companies that you can get relevant project experience, and actually build your resume, because the ones you have on your simple portfolio just aren't enough. To get a job nowadays, you have to stand out and showcase top level abilities and actually be able to compete with people who have that degree and or years of experience. I've actually been on the other side of the table, and I've hired and managed software engineers in my career. And the reality is that if you don't have a really strong background or insanely good project experience, your resume simply just isn't getting picked out of all of these applicants, especially nowadays when the tech job market is worse than it was before. For me, I'm actually not going to give up on becoming a really good engineer. I've made a lot of progress in the past, but I know that there's a lot of work that I need to do to continue to be successful. Right now, like I said before, I'm leaning more into free code camp because it feels a lot more flexible. I do spend a lot more time practicing rather than just looking at concepts or watching videos, which makes me actually feel like I'm building the skills of coding. At the end of the day, a bootcamp does work for somebody, and it's not going to be the only qualification you need to land a job. I will say for me, it was a bit of a waste of time, but I think there are alternative routes, and I think you still can get to it. And by learning to practice hands-on, you can learn to code and grow your skills better than just by watching somebody else.